Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and this is a presentation on downloads and inspiration. A couple of years ago, I wrote a book called Inspired: The Paranormal World of Creativity, and in that book, I went through a series of methods that people have used to get inspired ideas in their life. The method I have always used, and didn't really know I was using it, is I use a method where I walk. And I walk large distances, and it may put my mind at ease or at rest or whatever, and allow an inspiration. I remember my first download occurred at this very place, and it happened many, many years ago. I don't remember what the download was, but I remember the emotion, the absolute certainty, and the fact that something had just come into my mind, that I had just figured something out. So that was the first of my download experiences. A number of years ago, I wrote a book called Inspired: The Paranormal World of Creativity. And in that book, I described a number of different methods that have been used to gain inspiration and download, such as meditation, hypnosis, drumming, dancing, music, psychedelics, alien abduction, dreams. My second download experience came unexpectedly February the 26th, 2012 in Laughlin, Nevada, at the River Palms Casino on the banks of the Columbia River. It was a situation where I had sort of zoned out, which is one of the methods that can be used. I didn't really want to be in the lecture. I wasn't really interested in crop circles. And I was basically thinking about other things that I would rather be doing. It was at that point when I suddenly got a rush of material that came into my head, and it came with absolute certainty. This is where my third download experience started a couple of years ago. It was here at this McDonald's, about 1.5 miles from my home, and I was on my way on a walk to the downtown area, which is about 5 miles. I had just finished having coffee here, and I had started my next part of my trip heading downtown. Now that I've rewalked the trail downtown, it was actually farther down than I thought it was. It was here along this sidewalk where suddenly the ideas started to flow into my head, and there was about 24 of them, one after another. A little bit colder than it was today. I had to take off my glove, had to write, and I would get 7, 8, or 9 of them, put my glove back on, put my paper away, walk a little bit farther, and more would come, and I'd have to stop again, write those down. And this went on for maybe 10 minutes. And since then, the ideas sort of developed. There's been maybe 3 or 4 that have come after that. Once I've been thinking about the first ones, 3 or 4 more have come in, which makes basically a total of about 24, somewhere in there, of ideas that basically come down to, there's 2 different versions of the world. Is it this or is it that? And if you make the false assumption, the wrong assumption, you get everything wrong. So now I'll list off some of the ideas that I got on that morning a couple of years ago. Okay, here is basically what came in my third download, and I'm calling this Inspirations and Downloads. There was about 24 things. I'll go through quickly about 12. At one point, I'll do a full presentation on this. Basically, what I was getting is to look at everything, that there's two options. There's two possibilities for everything in the universe. Here's one example. Most people believe the world is made of nuts and bolts, little small particles, small particles that make up the universe. If that is true, then we have one particular type of universe, and you can determine a number of things and make estimates and predictions. However, if the ground of being of the universe, if the primary source of the universe is consciousness and not nuts and bolts, then literally everything changes. It's a completely different world. You make different assumptions, different conclusions. Everything has to be revisited. And so what this download thing was basically a number of these things. Is it this or is it that? Sort of giving this indirect indication that we're making the false assumption on a number of different issues. And that if you make the correct assumption, you can figure out the equation. It's almost like doing mathematics. You can do a very complicated equation where you have to do a number of different steps. If in step number 5 you add instead of subtract, nothing is going to help you get the right answer. You will get the wrong answer. So the thing is, there's a number of assumptions, and this was basically what was coming to me, a number of different assumptions we make, and the assumptions are wrong based upon this versus that. So the main one, and this is a big discussion in ufology now, about the role of consciousness. To understand the UFO phenomena is now claimed that you have to understand consciousness. So that's the first one. Knowing versus believing. A number of times when I deal with people who, when I start talking about experiencers, they'll always say, they'll use the know versus belief. They'll say that the people who are having the abduction experience or the experiencer experience just believe they're having that experience. And that the people who are doing the criticism know. I know, and you just believe. And what you'll see in ufology, that happens all the time. You'll come up against somebody who will say, no, I know that's wrong. You just believe you saw a UFO. You just believe you were on a ship. And the point is that we really look at the whole world, and it's all belief when you come right down to it. We really don't know absolutely for sure about anything. So nobody really knows. The best example you can get of knowing something is from experience. If you're in an experience and something happens, then you know if such a thing is possible. The people who think they know weren't there, and in fact, the actual opposite is true. The people who are claiming they know better than the people who are having UFO experiences are actually the believers. They are saying, I know that's not true based upon my belief system, what Sunday school I was brought up in, whether it's a religious Sunday school or whether it's a secular idea of the universe Sunday school. They're basing their disbelief on their previous beliefs and claiming they know. So this is another one, know versus belief. This shows you how flexible the universe can become in terms of this. This is a statue of Louis Riel, who was a major figure in the creation of the province of Manitoba, where I live in Canada. Louis Riel was basically executed because he was a bad guy. They executed him. They said, you know, he was troublemaker, whatever, number of charges. He was executed. Now today, that has changed. Louis Riel is now basically a hero. The idea that people knew that he was a bad guy has changed, and now the second Monday of February is a holiday in Manitoba called Louis Riel Day. So he went from being a bad guy to a good guy over a period of about 150 years. Here's another one that stuck in my head. When I was at university, I was taking a second year course on Soviet Union, and we would study criminology, looking at the Kremlin and what happens in the Kremlin, because it's all very secret. It's almost like the secret government behind the UFO thing. And if the government does this, that means something's happening. And if they do that, that means something's happening. But they won't make any direct statements. It's a matter of like a chess game to try to figure out what their moves indicate they're doing. My professor at the university was a very funny, young sort of girl who played off this. And she stated that Stalin died in 1953, and Stalin was considered the great hero of the Soviet Union. There's even a story told that when he died in 1953, so many people were trying to see his body that had been put under a glass case that 500 people actually were killed, being stampeded on, big disorder outside the place where he was kept, and the claim was 500 people died. So it was a major deal. He was very venerated. In 1961, that changed. They suddenly decided that he had killed millions of people, and they took his body out of the place where Lenin's body was kept and moved it away because now he was discredited as a great leader. My professor told me the story that when she went to the Soviet Union, she went there and actually played sort of a little joke that when she went to where Lenin's body was, she started to cry and sort of freak out. Where's Stalin's body? What have they done to Stalin? And she said the people were just fleeing from around her because this was still the Cold War. This is in the 1970s. And people were scared that she was going to get arrested and they would get arrested with her. And so you have again a situation where Stalin goes from being a very good guy to being a very bad guy. And it's just the belief is changing. Here's another one that came to me. Describe versus explain. A lot of times, whether it comes to the UFO situation or whether it comes to science or whatever, people will say, that's been explained. We understand that. We know how that works. That is explained. The actual fact is nobody's explaining anything. People are just describing what's going on in the universe. They claim they're explaining it, but they're just simply describing it. Here's an example. It's like the Moses opening the Red Sea. So you say, okay, Moses went to the Red Sea. He put his staff down. His staff was 6 feet high. He tapped the thing. The water opened. The children of Israel went through. Then he tapped his staff on the water again, and the sea closed up. And you say, that's very nice. Nice little story. You described what happened. Now explain how he did the trick. There's a big difference between describing what Moses did and explaining what Moses did. Here's the biggest one of them all. And this comes into naming theory. What we often do in the world is we define our ignorance by naming theory. So in this example, we take a cell that's dividing and we say, oh, the cell divided. It's the simplest thing in nature. It's very simple. It's just a cell dividing. And what we do is we give it a name and make it go away. It is a dramatic mystery. If you look at what happens with a cell, we are describing what the cell is doing, but we have no idea, none whatsoever, exactly how it does it. If you take a look at the situation, you have a cell which contains 100 trillion atoms. And what that cell will do when it divides in 16 hours is it will take the 100 trillion atoms. It will source them. It has to go and find these atoms from wherever it gets them. It has to gather them together, bring them together, and then put them in the right three-dimensional position in time and space to compose that cell. And it has to give it life, and it has to give it the memory, the ability to create the next cell, which will create the next cell, which will create the next cell, which eventually will make a human being with 100 trillion cells in it. Now, it does this in 16 hours. So just to say that the cell is dividing really is just describing what the cell is doing. The cell is doing it. We have not got the foggiest notion how to put the first 10 atoms together to make a cell. All we are doing is describing what nature itself is doing. We have no idea, no explanation of exactly what it's doing, and we can't do it ourselves. There's another one. This is a burr. We actually developed Velcro from this. This is a burr that will attach to your clothes when you're walking through a bush. Here it is actually stuck to my finger, and it has these little tiny little hooks on the end of this burr, and this thing develops through some sort of process, some sort of pattern process that develops this thing, and it just develops this. So we take it, we make Velcro out of it and say, oh, we discovered Velcro. We discovered this whole thing. We really didn't discover anything. All we did was duplicate what nature did. We have no idea at all of how this burr actually developed itself to do what it does. It's just a big mystery, and we can describe the little hooks on it. We can describe how it develops, but we cannot explain it. Beginning, end versus eternal. A lot of times in our world, we use the beginning of this, the end of that. And we already know, whether you're looking at a mystical view of the universe or whether you're looking at the Big Bang, there basically is no beginning and end. So what this comes down to is, when you're using beginning and end, you're creating something that really doesn't exist. Everything is basically eternal, and you have to define what's going on based upon the correct assumption that there is no beginning or end to anything. Oneness versus separation is probably the biggest message of, I believe, the intelligence behind the phenomena. This comes on into the idea that we believe, mostly in this world, and this may be a false assumption, that everything is separate, that you and I are separate objects floating around in time and space. And it's all very meaningless. It's random and it's meaningless. So we're just things, particles bang into each other, and it's not until a particle hits another particle that anything happens in the universe. What the message 54% of all experiencers claim, that they are given the message of oneness when they're having their experience with this intelligence behind the UFO phenomena. The idea of oneness is that everything is connected, everything is one. And this is an important concept if this is true. Because if it's true, then if you suddenly realize that we are the aliens and the aliens are us, then everything changes. If you realize your enemy is you and you are your enemy, everything changes. It becomes very hard to kill someone or steal something when you realize they are part of you. This, I believe, is the key message that they are trying to get across. And mystical experiences will describe this. When you have a person taking ayahuasca or high dose psilocybin or whatever, they quite often describe this phenomena, that their ego, their idea of oneness, their idea of separation, that they are an ego separate from everybody else, their ego is crushed and they realize that everything is alive and connected. Edgar Mitchell described coming back from the moon, his big epiphany. He suddenly realized that everything in the universe was connected. It came as this, what's one of the sort of descriptions of a mystical experience. He realized this oneness connection. Came back, started experiments with ESP, developed the Ions Institute, and then later on created the Edgar Mitchell Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters. He realized this very important idea of consciousness and the fact that everything is connected, everything is one. This is my friend Brett Oldham. I hopefully get him on my radio show. He wrote a book called The Children of the Greys, very, very important book. And in the book, I've quoted it many times. He confronted the being, a tall being who had him on the ship. And he said, I want to know, what's your concept of God? And he said he was just floored. The being looked at him and said, we are one with the one who is all. And this gets to this idea that a lot of experiencers are given this idea about oneness, that we are all connected, we are all one. And we have to understand this concept of oneness to stop the fighting, to stop the war, to stop the idea that animals are objects, that the earth is an object, and we can abuse and use objects. Everything is connected. We are connected to everything in the universe. This was an interesting also a sort of a oneness connection. And people will often describe this with starlings. I actually just saw this morning, and it'll be in another sort of presentation I do on birds and UFOs, as I have Mike Clellan coming onto my show in a few weeks. Everybody knows the idea that starlings can fly in huge groups,
and they can move left, right, up, down, circle, and no birds ever collide with each other. They are actually flying as if they are one bird, and yet they're moving these very high movements. This morning I saw something even more spectacular than that. I saw these are seagulls, or I think they were seagulls, but anyway, they were moving in this one pattern, and I was along a fence on a railway track, and I was trying to get a picture of them flying. And what happens is this section of birds, about 40, is going up and down, flying in this sort of a massive formation, and they were going in behind these trees, and I couldn't see them. And then they'd land on the railway track, then they'd take off again. And it took a while, and all of a sudden they took off in the railway track, and I was ready to catch them on camera, and I suddenly realized from the right was another group of about 40 or 50 birds coming, and they were both groups of birds were flying directly at each other. This is an actual bizarre picture that I got of them as they come together, these two sections of birds, and no birds collided with each other, and yet they were all moving at a very high speed, these two movements of birds, 40 or 50 in each group, colliding with each other, moving in together, and all the birds sort of went into this big sort of pattern, and all for a couple of seconds created one group, and then the two groups suddenly separated and went flying off in different directions. Very, very bizarre. And this is something that there's absolutely no way we could do. If you took 40 F-18 jet fighters and 40 F-18 jet fighters going the other direction and flew them right into each other, you would just have a pile of metal. Birds have this ability to work as one, to be able to know sort of where they are in time and space. And it's a very, very bizarre phenomenon that people really don't understand how birds are able to do this. When I got down the path after I took this picture of birds, I was at the Forks, and they had a display on bees making honey. And these were the beekeepers had a display there. They had the different types of honey. And I've known for many years that this is one of the most bizarre things in nature, that if you want to learn something about how nature works, is to watch the bees. The bees operate the same as has been described with the intelligence on board a flying saucer. And it's known as sort of a hive mentality. And basically the bees are all working for one. They all do exactly what they're supposed to do. You have these little bees that go and get the nectar. They live no more than 4 weeks. They basically just burn themselves out and they die. You have the queen that for 7 years will do 2,000 eggs a day. It is protected, and they build this hive. And I thought I knew everything about bees and how complex this whole thing is, how they actually work together. So you have bees that only live a couple of weeks, actually have this knowledge of exactly what to do. And so what they were describing to me this morning, which I didn't really realize, is when they pull the tray, they have about 9 trays, they pull a tray out, the bees will take the honey, they'll put it into the little cells, and then they will take it down to 18% humidity. And I said to the guy, I never heard this before. I said, they take it down to 18% humidity? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, how do they do that? I mean, how would a bee know that you've got to get this honey down to an 18%? And he said, well, I don't know how they know it's got to be 18%, but it is 18%. And what they do is they flap their wings, and they alongside where they're keeping that thing, the honey, they will flap their wings until it's down to 18% humidity, and then they will seal it off with wax. So this guy who has hives himself basically described to me that when you pull the tray out, then you scrape this wax off and you put it in a spinner and you spin it, and all the honey will come out of the cells. Then he says you put the tray back in to the box where the bees are, and he said they will absolutely clean this thing as if it were brand new. They will take all the honey that didn't come out. They will rebuild the cells, because by taking off the honey or taking off the wax that they seal the honey in, you actually destroy some of the cells. So he said the bees will take it and they will rebuild all the cells, make them all exactly the same size, and and clean it all out as if it were a brand new honeycomb, and start the whole process all over again. So you take this type of thing where you see this oneness thing where there is no ego, there is no simple person who says, okay, I'm a better bee than everybody else, and I'm going to make my own little thing. They work as one, which gets back to this sort of oneness principle. One life versus multiple lives. This is critically important in the UFO community. We've been assuming for a long time, and almost all the assumptions we make when we try to figure out what are the intelligence doing, what's the whole deal, is we assume that we have one life, that it's been given unto man to live but once. That may be true. And if that's true, then you have certain things like people being taken on board a ship against their will, you have abductions. But if it's multiple lives, if reincarnation is a fact, and I will maintain that reincarnation has as much evidence as there is for extraterrestrials visiting here. If reincarnation, if multiple lives are a fact, then literally everything in the UFO community changes. Everything, everything, everything. You have to rethink everything. And the prime one would be the whole idea about abductions. People use the word abductions. This person was taken against their will. And yet, in the multiple life thing, and I've asked a number of regressionists about this, if you regress them and you take them back to their when they're born and say, at any point did you choose to be in this situation, this abduction experience, they will all say, yes, I chose this. If it's multiple lives, then the key thing that changes is the good and the bad, and life and death all change, and all it is one continuous eternal life where you're learning lessons. So you have good things and bad things, you get dealt certain cards, and that you choose the cards. And that's the whole thing about multiple lives, that if you're looking at the UFO phenomena, I maintain that you have to look at it in terms of multiple lives to really understand what's actually going on. A number of experiencers will describe that the being that they were interacting with was in their past life. John Mack described situations like this. I've got a couple of people, a couple will be on my show who I will talk to, who say quite clearly that they remember before they were born that they made the decision and the beings were with them to come onto this earth. And the prime example I can sort of cite for this, there are a lot of them, is Chris Bledsoe, who's kind of become a sort of a famous experiencer in North Carolina. He was regressed by an associate of Bud, John Mack. His name was Dr. Michael O'Connor. And during the regression, the transcript, Michael O'Connor asked Chris Bledsoe, when did you first encounter these beings? And he said, they have been with me since before I was born. This is critically important. If it's one life, and it may only be one life, but if it's one life, then it's one world. But if it's multiple lives, you have to basically rethink everything that you're thinking about, because a lot of stuff will change. Random versus pattern. We are the secular Sunday school version of this is that we are biological robots in a random, meaningless universe. And yet you take a look and you start looking at things, and the more you look at it, the more it appears that it's really not that random, that a lot of stuff is pattern. The prime example I can cite, and will, as I said, be much more specific about all these sort of examples in the future. But the whole thing about random is the whole idea of whether it's remote viewing, whether it's psychics or mediums or whatever. If someone can predict the future, if they can say that 3 days from now you are going to have a car accident, then it would appear that the world is not quite as random as we think it is. It may be something quite different. And the way we have it now is everything is a random accident. Everything is just the Big Bang. And after that, the dice are rolling. And therefore, if you are looking at this presentation, you didn't choose to look at this presentation by that theory. It's just random event. It's all background noise, and you just think there's a pattern. You actually think that things are happening because you're choosing them. If it's a random world, then everything, including all the people who are attending this, the fact that I'm giving this presentation, the fact that I got into UFOs, really doesn't mean anything. It's just random noise in a random universe. The more you look at it, the more it appears to be pattern. Again, this watching this and talking, it's it can't be possible in a random world. This is where people get these crazy ideas that consciousness is an illusion, because when you start looking at how this random thing works, it doesn't make much sense in terms of the things that are happening, to assume that everything that's happening is just for 13.7 billion years of dice rolling. And that's why you came here. That's why you got up today. That's everything that happened is just a matter of somebody rolling the same dice over and over. And this is particularly damaging to the extraterrestrial theory. I believe that one of the main reasons that people have a hard time believing that there are extraterrestrials that may look exactly like us is because it is so unlikely that over 13.7 billion years that life on this universe, on this earth, would be created. It's you have accident after accident after accident, genetic mutation after genetic mutation after genetic mutation for 13 billion years. And then to have suddenly an extraterrestrial on another planet look exactly the same, that would mean that the same 13.7 billion years, somebody in a separate room was rolling the same dice and rolled exactly the same dice for 13.7 billion years. And if you start looking at the humanoid pattern, the research that's been done, there's 20,000 humanoid reports, 1,000 different aliens. But what you basically look at is they all basically are looking pretty much the same, which would indicate that there's a pattern. It's not a random event. Life forming is not a random event. It's something that is following a pattern. This would be backed up also by the fact that aliens, people will always complain about the genetic program that the Greys appear to have. If Greys are breeding with human beings, then it would appear that the DNA is pretty close. We cannot breed with a monkey or chimpanzee, which is like 98%, which would indicate the human and alien DNA has to be almost exactly the same. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to breed. Life versus death. I'll get more into this later on, but this is one where, again, it goes back to this single life thing, this duality thing, which is a big problem. That we believe there's duality, when in fact all there is the belief in duality. So we believe there's good and bad, there's light and dark, there's positive and negative, almost like we sort of assume that if we get down to the sort of the atomic level, we're going to see a little negative sign on the side of an electron and a little positive sign on the nucleus. This idea it may work in terms of naming theory to help us understand what's going on, but people have to realize that we put those names, negative and positive, on different particles, and to help us understand their association. They're actually working as one. They're actually working together. They have their thing they're supposed to do. We put negative and positive, the same as with life and death. The only example I'll sort of bring up here with life and death is we assume that death is bad. When you look at the human body, there are 180 million cells every minute die in the human body. And every minute, 180 million cells are replaced by basically the same type of cell. So there's this process of replacing these cells. Now, people will say, well, we don't want death. We just want life because death is bad, life is good. If you do not get death, these 180 million cells die. If you get a cell or a bunch of cells that suddenly decide they're not going to die, they're just going to continue to reproduce and not die and not follow the pattern, that's called cancer. That's called cells out of control. Death and life is a unique process, and it's part of the same thing. You basically, we're just putting labels on these things, and we're saying we want this, we don't want that, and basically it's all part of the same thing. Again, here's the cell where you have these cells that are being replaced, and tremendous numbers of cells. It's part of a process, and death is a very important part of it. And Newtonian physics, this is one that's pretty well described in science quite a bit, so I'm not going to get too much into this. The idea that we had Newtonian physics, and then we suddenly have quantum physics. So the Newtonian physics is the big world, and it has certain laws that gravity and all these different things that apply to it. And then suddenly when you get to the quantum world, they're very, very small. Suddenly there's completely new rules. And this is a thing that's trying to be sort of put together as one theory in the scientific community, but there are basically two different laws of how, rules of the universe, depending upon whether you're talking big objects, Newtonian, or quantum objects, and it's massive confusion. Is it the laws of quantum physics that rule everything, or is it Newtonian physics? So here again, you have this idea, and this popped into my head. Noun versus verb is basically the same sort of thing. This is this naming theory. We give everything a name, and we give it a position in time and space, and we say it's just an object in time and space, when in fact, and I won't get too much into this, there's been a lot of people discuss this. Actually, the universe is a verb. Everything is in movement. Everything is moving. There really are no single objects. An object is part of a bigger movement. It's all connected, and everything is in motion. There really is no stationary sort of object thing. That's where we get into this dualism thing and this belief in the world being made of nuts and bolts, so we turn everything into a noun. And it gets us into a lot of trouble. If we start looking at everything as a verb, as a process, it's easier to understand what's actually going on. Good, evil versus neutral. I won't get too much in. I argue quite a bit about this. This idea that there are good aliens and evil aliens, and as above, so below, which sort of indicates there are evil races on this earth, which I always say, well, is it the Jews? Is it the blacks? I mean, this idea that there are good people and evil people. In fact, the entire universe is neutral. It has a process, and there is no good or bad. So you basically have, instead of good people and evil people, you have souls that are reincarnating through lifetimes, and they do good and bad. They have positive and negative things that move their lessons up and down. But the idea that there are people who are totally good and people that are totally evil, as far as I'm concerned, is total craziness. Light versus darkness, I won't get too much. One of my main theories about how consciousness works is this light versus darkness. The alien channel Bashar sort of put this out at one point, said there is no such thing as darkness. Darkness is not a thing unto itself. Darkness is just the absence of light. All you really have in the universe is light. And the farther you're away from the light, the darker it gets. And therefore, it's not really a thing. It's just sort of a description of how far you're away from the light, which is my understanding of how consciousness works and how people are able to do download type stuff, is that we are like in an ocean. There is no sort of levels. That's nouns again. It's just a verb. It's all like water. And at the top is the light. And the closer you get to the light, the more you can see, the more you understand that all the information is in there. And the reason that we don't have the information is we're far away from the light. We're in the darkness of the ocean at the bottom. And from time to time, someone is able to have a meditation, a head injury, a dream, or whatever, and they're able to float higher into the water, get closer to the light, see more, and pick up something that everybody else can't see, then float back down into the darkness and say, look what I discovered, I got this material. It's all the same thing. It's all just how far you are away from the light. There really is no such thing as darkness. Santa Claus versus aliens, this is one that I always quote. People will always say, the aliens, they're not here to help us. Why don't they feed the poor people? Why don't they do this? Why don't they do that? And I'm about to present a lecture on what I think, and I call it the theory of wow, as to what the aliens are actually doing. Many people in the UFO community actually confuse aliens with Santa Claus. They think the aliens are here to bring us some toys. They're here to give us free energy. They're here to save the poor people. They're here to, stop our pollution. And in fact, they aren't here as Santa Claus. They are, I believe, just sort of creating sort of messages, giving information, and it's still up to us. And in a reincarnation world, even if we destroy the world, we're going to learn our lessons, even if we have to go somewhere else. What happens around us really doesn't matter. And we have this sort of external world where instead of being internally motivated and deciding what do we have to do based upon our life here and what we're supposed to be doing here, we're externally motivated. So we're waiting for Santa Claus to come as aliens, or we're waiting for the government to save us, or we're waiting for some messiah politician to save our problems. And in fact, it is an individual thing. All it is you and I are part of one. we are here to do something, and we all have to do is worry about ourselves and quit waiting for some Santa Claus or some Messiah to come and make our life better. That's it. That's about half of the 24 that I got. And as I described in an earlier part of this presentation, this came very, very suddenly. It was one after another over maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And then I got a couple new ones after that that sort of popped in my head later on, 6 months later. And I actually had a couple of ones that I said, oh, I'll remember this. I don't have to write this down. And those I don't remember. So I actually had a couple that hopefully they pop back into my head. But that's a little bit about this idea of inspirations and downloads. I've had them. And again, it's like the idea of knowing versus believing. I may be wrong. It's a belief, but it's as close to knowing as you can get because I was there and I experienced it. Again, thanks for listening.